you can feel nostalgia and you can feel incredible pain at the same time,
Mm,
and that that's okay and that's normal, and that there's hundreds, if not probably thousands of people who have experienced the same, and it's so isolating that this isn't a topic that there's much research about or
mm,
much even discourse about, and that creates this feeling of I'm the only one.
mm.
And so I just want to affirm to any survivor listening that you are not the only one.
Hi, and welcome back to Full-Time Grievers. This week we are going to be doing a special interview with Selysa, who has a specialty of supporting people grieving abusive relationships in particular, and wanted to spend a little time interviewing Selysa so that we can all find out a little bit more about that and even how you came to this work. So, Selysa, do you want to give us a little context of how you got started doing that work and sort of like how you entered that even as a field of work?
Yeah, so I come from a background of a lot of grief and a lot of grieving of abusers. I grieved my father when I was 13, who sexually abused me. And that wasn't an end of relationship through death. That was an end of relationship through him being incarcerated and me and him no longer having custody of me and me no longer seeing him again. So he is still living today and we don't have any relationship. So that was a big grief. And then
Yeah.
when I was 21, my mother passed away, and my mother was had a lot of good attributes about her. She played the piano, she taught me to sing and to play music, and she was addicted to drugs my entire life, which led to a lot of neglect, a lot of emotional abuse, and a lot of manipulation and control. So when she did die, so that was a grief through death that happened. She passed away due to a brain aneurysm, which is a super out of the blue thing to happen to someone. And when that happened, that was another really, really complex grieving of an abusive relationship. So both of those events kind of set me up to be on my healing path and study a lot of healing arts in my early adulthood. And then when I went and started my business, I was just kind of trying to help everyone. And then I went to this really cool business coaching program, which is where I met you, Nathan.
Mhm.
And they encouraged us to choose a niche, is how they insist we call it. But I really prefer to say niche. And I just received this moment of like divine download come on me saying that what I needed to do was support people grieving abusive relationships. And I thought to myself, that's way too specific. There's no one else out there on earth who also has to deal with that. And then I realized there's so many other people on earth and no one is talking about it. And no one is doing the work on that specialty. And that's why I'm called to it. So I received it and then I just kind of stuck with it and it's remained aligned for me. And it's been over 5 years now that I've been in that niche.
Yeah. Uh, I, I, I'm so glad you're doing the work that you're doing. I do think it's so important, and I do, like you found, think that there's just so many folks who struggle with it. But will you help us, for those who don't have any experience with this or who may be wondering, you know, those who haven't experienced abuse, maybe not wouldn't even realize that people leaving abusive relationships or at the end of an abusive relationship or when the relationship ends because the abuser dies, they may be wondering, like, why do you need to grieve that at all? Do you want to say a little bit
Mhm.
about that part?
Yeah, so there's this construct in our society where if someone abused you and society believes that the abuse happened. The bystanders, this family and friends who have never endured abuse, and some who even have, go into this really strong black and white thinking of, thank goodness you're out of there. You need to stay out of there and stay gone. And when people have feelings of longing or missing towards their abuser, most people don't even get a moment to externalize those feelings because they're already so bombarded with the message that it's not okay to have those feelings. And if the person does have those feelings and say them out loud, they're really not going to be validated, and they're going to be hit with comments like, it's so great that you're out of there. How could you think of going back to that monster? Just a lot of invalidating of the longing and missing towards the abuser that doesn't help the griever grieve the full spectrum of the relationship that is now over.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, we see it even in relationships that don't involve abuse at all, where we, tend to, once they're gone, really, elevate them and kind of, some people would even say, sugarcoat how they were, or, we look at just their golden traits, if you will.
Hmm.
And so I can really see how that would become even more rigid in a relationship where you're grieving, or where the culture around you, the supporters around you, recognize that you may be grieving someone who was abusive
Hmm.
in your relationship with them. So you have called this forbidden grief. Do you want
Hmm.
to say a little bit more about that terminology and how that's working for folks?
Yeah, so forbidden grief, there's two sides to this coin. One side is if the survivor is believed that they were abused, they are not allowed to grieve the positive of the relationship. So, for example, when I turned my father in when I was 13 and I was grieving the end of that relationship, I was literally split in two. A part of me was grieving the fact that this horrible thing had happened to me and I was dealing with the aftershocks of that trauma.
Hmm.
And the other part of me was grieving my daddy who taught me how to ride a bike.
Yeah.
And in no circle or counseling or familial or anywhere on earth that I ever experienced was there a space for me to talk about both of those polarities. And
Hmm.
so I shoved away my grief of the good things and only was allowed to grieve the bad things.
Yeah.
So that's the one end. One end is that you're only allowed to grieve the bad.
Yeah.
And then the other end is actually if society doesn't believe that the abuse happened. So, for example, with my mother, it wasn't nearly as heinous of a crime of the way my mother mothered my siblings and I versus my father. And so, because it was a lot less heinous of a crime, and she maintained positive and ish enough relationships with her family through the end of her life. After she passed away, and I started sharing positive and negative memories with her where I was saying, "Oh, this was so sweet." This is the day that she taught me this song on the piano and gave me all the feedback I needed. And then I would also mention, "Oh yeah, no, she didn't feed us. She was locked in her room doing drugs for days." And it was really, really challenging for especially people who knew her, but just anyone who knew me to hear me speak negatively of my mother. And people would often brush past it and tell me to forget it and forgive her. So I quickly learned that it was not okay to speak negatively of an abuser because I wasn't believed that abuse happened. So I experienced both opposites, one with my father and one with my mother. My father of only being believed that the abuse happened, so therefore no positive grief is allowed. And with my mother, only being believed that abuse didn't happen, therefore only remember the good things grief was allowed. And so that's what's forbidden.
Yeah, yeah, and I appreciate that I really don't like that you've had experience with both, but I appreciate that you know about both ends of this and can really help folks grapple with, they may be on only experiencing one side of it, but it's still that, this forbidden grief as you're calling it, and they may or they, may be experiencing only the other side of it and still, having this term of the forbidden grief as a way of relating to the part of what I'm going through that isn't being allowed by my support people, and
Mhm.
especially in this kind of context of when we've lost someone either through death or incarceration in the case of your dad. The people around us, we're really reliant on what they'll support us with or not, and
Mhm.
so recognizing that there can be this part of our very normal, very natural grieving process that our people around us, for one reason or the other, can't really grapple with or understand. I think it's just so useful, especially in this more complex system of going through the grieving process around someone who wasn't just kind and loving and generous and easygoing and a joy for us to be around, but we have this really kind of painful additional piece to our relationship with. So you've said something about it already, but like let's really underscore for folks, why do you think it's so important for survivors to do the grieving process, even with people who they've been in relationships that were abusive?
So, the antidote to forbidden grief is what I call full spectrum grief. And full spectrum grief gives permission for survivors to feel every single emotion that they have around the loss of the person without judgment or shooting on them or trying to put them into the black and white narrative of only the good or only the bad. And that is so important because when survivors fully grieve and are properly supported in their grief, they're allowed to fully heal from the full complexity of the situation. And when they're allowed to heal from that full complexity of situation, they are able to break the cycle of abuse.
Hmm. Will you say that again? Let's really underscore that point because that's
Yeah.
huge what you're saying there.
When survivors are able to fully heal, they break the cycle of abuse.
And so let's, if you don't mind, like let's go the other direction for a second. If they don't have that opportunity to fully heal, what's likely to happen with that cycle?
So, what's likely to happen is that they are still suppressing or possibly self medicating their challenging emotions, and they will either re enter into abusive relationships as adults or continue the cycle of abuse themselves by becoming abusers to other people.
Mm.
So, it's really, really important for people to have this full spectrum of grief
Yeah.
so that they don't continue hurting other people.
Yeah. I got full body chills hearing you describe that because I think, yeah, it really, it's like it strikes me like lightning how vital interrupting that cycle is and how easy it is to not do so, especially if we're not allowed the full spectrum of our grief in this particular case. So you're saying instead of like instead of promoting forbidden grief or allowing ourselves to be, allowing ourselves to be to stay in a system or to only be supported by a system, let's say, that isn't allowing all of our grief. If we step out of that and give ourselves this opportunity for the full spectrum of our grief, then we can be with the like really beautiful parts of the relationship and grieve those, and we can be with the parts that were really painful for us and grieve those, and through that be doing really major work to break the cycle of abuse that we've been part of up to this point.
Yeah, I have a strong example of that.
Okay, yeah, let's hear it.
So, my father was a whitewater raft guide. He was a super adventurous outdoorsman. And I am so grateful for the exposure to and comfort in nature that I have
Mm.
now because of his influence. So, through a series of events, the raft that we used growing up as a child, it's like a really great commercial quality whitewater raft, ended up in my brother's possession, and then it ended up in my possession. And
Mm.
I used to be a commercial whitewater raft guide.
Wow.
And when I was a commercial whitewater raft guide, I was using my father's, I call it a guide stick. So it's the paddle that the guide uses, but it's a lot bigger. And as a really petite person, it's really helpful to have the extra reach of a longer paddle. And it's this really cool guide stick. It has this cool blue swirling on the shaft of it. And my guests would be in the raft with me, and I'd be using this guide stick that has my father's name on it. And they
Mm.
would say, I was super insecure my first year of raft guiding because I was so small, and as soon as the group got assigned to me, I saw a little bit of terror and dread enter their faces, thinking, "Oh no, we're going in the boat by this tiny woman. What about this huge man over here? Like, why don't we get this huge man to take us down the river?" So to compensate for my insecurity, when people would ask me, "How long have you been whitewater rafting?" I would answer, "Since I was 6 years old." And that would assuade a lot of their anxieties. They were like, "Oh, she grew up doing this." And that was a completely true answer. I had been doing it since I was 6 years old. And then they would comment on my paddle, and I'd say, "Yeah, this was my dad's paddle. It's my paddle now." And then now I own my father's raft, and it's really been an evolving relationship for me to make sense of why this raft and this guide paddle are so sentimental and important to me. And for so many years, I felt super conflicted and guilty about loving and being very attached to these objects. And many times my partner has been like, "Let's sell this and buy a different one. This is heavy, this is big." And I've adamantly refused, like, "No. This is
Mm.
I love this. I'm keeping this. This is very important to me." And so, me eventually coming to terms with the fact that this is my relationship to the blessings that my father did give me, and that's perfectly valid and normal and fine for me to have that, has been such a relief for me to
Mm.
give
Yeah.
myself that permission to love and protect and keep this raft and this guide paddle.
Yeah. Listening to you talk about it, it strikes me too that there's this way in which you, I mean, you're saying as much, but you've really been able to give yourself the gift of what is available to you, what is meaningful to you, what is worthy of you carrying forward from this really, still it's a pivotal relationship. It didn't go the way that you would have most preferred, and you don't get to, you're not having that relationship in your life. You've been doing the grieving of that relationship, but you have gotten to own and benefit from the parts that were really useful to you, really empowering, really
Mhm.
healthy. And
Mhm.
that's, I think, like such a keen example of the gifts that can be available for us if we're available to have the, and give ourselves permission to have the full spectrum grief, like you're saying.
Mhm. Yeah, and
Wow.
when I was still shoving myself into the box of forbidden grief, I was really judging myself for having this object, and I was really feeling a lot of dread and conflicting feelings about having it. And now that I've given myself permission for this full spectrum grief, I love that I have this object, and I take excellent care of it, and I make sure everyone who uses it or uses it with me treats it like a precious object.
Mm. Yeah, it really reminds me, we did the episode we talked about Warden's four tasks of mourning, among some other things, but I'm just remembering that transforming piece, right? Like,
Mhm.
and coming after surrendering, so allowing the change for you as you were going through your grieving process and surrendering to the process that you were in, really being able to transform your relationship with these objects,
Mhm.
and get the benefit of what they mean to you now. Oh,
Yeah.
so powerful to
Thank
give
you.
yourself that.
This episode is brought to you by the Center for Emotional Education and Sacramento Reiki Center, where we support full-time grievers every day. Many of our clients have tried everything and it still hasn't been enough. After our work together, they gain the tools and skills that they need to navigate their grief on their own. You can get more information at sacramentoreikicenter.com and centerforoemotionaleducation.com.
All right. So then I really appreciate you sharing that example and giving us more of a sense of, what can be in store for us if we allow ourselves to move out of the kind of forbidden grief and into this full spectrum grief and grieving process, allowing all the things that come up for us. And bringing it back to, someone who's been in an abusive relationship, what would you say to anyone listening who is freshly out of an abusive relationship, whether it's because the relationship ended and just came to an end or because their partner has passed?
I would tell them to give themselves permission to feel all of their feelings, regardless of how contradictory they may seem. And that you can feel nostalgia and you can feel incredible pain at the same time.
Mm,
And that that's okay and that's normal. And that there's hundreds, if not probably thousands of people who have experienced the same. And it's so isolating that this isn't a topic that there's much research about or
mm,
much even discourse about. And that creates this feeling of I'm the only one.
mm,
And so I just want to affirm to any survivor listening that you are not the only one, that so many other people have gone through this and it is normal. And if anyone tries to put you in black and white boxes of only remembering good or only remembering bad, you can use my name. You can send them a link to this podcast. You can say, no, actually, this podcast says I'm allowed to feel it all. Thank you very much.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
push back against that if you have the strength and courage to. And if you don't in that moment, that's okay. You can just know in your heart that it goes in one ear and out the other, and you don't need to internalize it because it's not your truth and it's not what you need in that moment.
Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciate that you're emphasizing not just, it doesn't have to be black and white. It doesn't have to be, like you only grieve this part and you don't get to grieve this part, but that it can even be in this full spectrum idea. It's not just like this, and it is the full range, but it's not just the full range. It's also carrying and holding space for these oppositions, even that you're talking about, where it feels like some of what I'm grieving is even like the opposite or opposed to this other part that I'm also grieving and that I'm also, having these feelings around. I really think it's so useful and powerful to give people that permission, like that you're talking about, but not just permission to be with all the feelings, but even permission to be with feelings that feel like they are in contradiction to one another.
Mm-hmm.
So useful, especially in this particular grieving context.
Mm-hmm.
So, along kind of the same lines, then, what would you say to people who love a survivor and want to be their best, or want to do their best to support their survivor in the grieving process that they're going through?
So if you truly want to support survivors, it is very important that you, the listener, acknowledge how much you don't know and how
Mm,
much you couldn't know because you don't have their lived experience. So instead of
Gosh,
trying
yeah.
to assume that you can even sympathize with what they're going through, just understand that you don't and you can't. And you can't unless you do undergo a very similar situation. So don't try to. And so what you
Yeah.
can do instead of trying to looks like making a lot of placating comments such as it's so great that that's over. I'm so happy you're gone now. Instead of that those all of those comments come from a place of assumption, and instead of coming from a place of assumption, come from a place of humility and ignorance and name that. And you can even say to the survivor that you love, I have no idea what you're experiencing right now, but I'm here for you. What do you need? Because you don't need to know the perfect thing to say to them, to be there for them. All you need to do is be with them in the dark.
Yeah. I really appreciate how you're framing that. And you know, would go even further a little bit, to underscore some of what you're implying there, that if you don't know, don't act like oh, I so get that. Oh, I know just what you mean. Oh, I know just what that's like in your support phrases. Instead, lean toward things like, oh, I understand what you're saying, or I really get the gravity of what you're sharing with me, or I can't possibly understand what all you're going through, but I really hear you.
Yeah.
Again, emphasizing, if on the side of what's true for you, that you don't know what they went through, but you're hearing them, you're listening to them, and you're grokking what they're sharing with you.
Hmm.
Which, when someone is sharing with us, especially something so vulnerable as that, and especially in a context or culture where there is this kind of forbiddenness around certain grieving, to communicate that we're here for the full spectrum, really just staying with, you know I'm hearing you. I understand what you're saying. I can't know what it's like, but I'm really getting a sense of what you're sharing. Staying
Hmm.
on those kinds of phrases.
Yeah.
And like you're saying too, we don't have to be able to fix it. We don't have to be able to like put the right, the bow on it, or cast it in just the right light that makes them go, oh, you're right. This isn't that big of a deal. We just have to be with them in that process. They're going to find their
Hmm.
own way.
Yes.
Any other last thoughts for folks who may be navigating this process of, coming to terms with the full spectrum of their grief, in the loss of an abusive relationship?
I have thousands of other thoughts about this,
I'm sure
yes.
you do, actually. Yeah.
And what I'll end with is your relationship to your body and healing your relationship with your body is one of the most important things you can do to heal from being abused, whether it was physical or emotional abuse.
Mhm. Yeah.
And what we talked about in this episode, this is the tip of the iceberg.
That's right. Yeah.
Um, and there's so much more than this that is necessary to full recovery from abuse. So don't think, okay, I listened to this episode, I get it now.
I'm done. Yeah.
Yeah. But rather that this is really just the starting point into a really underdeveloped niche of grieving abusive relationships. And there's so much more than this. There's so many other keys necessary to healing from abuse. So just because you listen to this doesn't mean you now know how to support a survivor. And it
Sure.
doesn't mean you are extremely versed and have all of the tools necessary. This is just the beginning of the work. And it's just the awakening to this realization.
Yeah. So important. And I think for people who are navigating this level of complex grieving process, it's really doubly important to get support, especially if you're in a family or you're in a culture, or it seems like many of your supporters kind of traffic in this culture of the forbidden sides of grief, right? So
Mhm.
if you if you're more likely, or if you give yourself the opportunity to get support, then you're more likely to get this ability to have the full spectrum of your feelings.
Mhm.
Uh, and there's no one better to support them than you, Selysa. So I hope they find you
Mm.
in
Thank you,
particular.
Nathan. I will say also that in something this specific, you deserve to have someone supporting you who carries some of the same identifiers that you do. So, for example, I am so much better supported. I'm Latina. I'm so much better supported by a Latina or Latinx um, care support therapist, coach, anything than I am by any other marker of things because they just get there's so much I don't have to teach and explain to them because
Hmm.
they just get it. Whereas
Hmm.
when I'm working with anyone else, I do a lot of translating of my familial experience to theirs. So I would say, especially in something that's so home front oriented of domestic violence being this thing that might actually be really rooted in your culture's history, to really seek out someone that shares some level of culture or similarity with you in that way for the support.
Beautiful. Yeah. Well, thank you again, Selysa. I really appreciate you letting us kind of interview you this time and sharing with our listeners, some of this really particular study that you've been doing and the particular niche of support that you're in, and speaking, in this case, particularly to those folks who may be in this kind of grieving process. So thank you so much for being willing to share your expertise with us this week.
It's been an honor.
Hey, thanks for listening to Full-Time Grievers. Please like this video, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you find out when we release the next episode. If you have thoughts or questions about what we shared, please leave them in the comments below. And if this episode made you think of someone, we invite you to send it to them. They could probably use it. Also, don't forget to get your free Receiving Support While Grieving guide in the show notes below.